Hello and welcome to this webinar. It's my great pleasure to officiate today. My name is Sally Hardy and I am the Chief Executive of the Regional Studies Association. Today, the topic of the webinar is managing funded research projects. And I'm really honoured to be joined by two extremely successful researchers, Jennifer Clark and Henry Yeung. I'm sure they need no introduction, but nevertheless, in a minute, I will introduce them to you. I'm going to start just by giving a little bit of an introduction to the session and then a couple of housekeeping points. So the Regional Studies Association is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development and policy. We support our members and the broader community with the latest research. We have a number of grant funding schemes. We offer multiple networking opportunities as well as publishing opportunities. And we offer spaces in which you can grow both your career and your research. This webinar series, the Professional Development Series, is one of two series that we started as a response to the global crisis with COVID. The other is the Regions, Cities and Industry series, and there's more detail on all of these webinars that are free to attend on our website. If you're going to our website, I also encourage you to have a quick look at the RSA Hub, which is an app that you can download both to your desktop and your mobile, which will give you all the information you need about what we're doing, what the deadlines are coming up, what the opportunities are that we're offering in one simple place. So a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available in the RSA Lounge. If you have questions for either of the speakers, please put them in the Q&A box, normally found at the bottom of your screen. And if you like Twitter, feel free to tweet using the hashtag RSA webinar. So let me move on without any further ado to our two speakers. What we thought we would do is short interventions by the speakers, followed by a discussion between us that will be fed and informed by questions that you as our audience give to us in the Q&A box. So kicking off our afternoon will be Jennifer Clark. Jennifer works at the Ohio State University. She is Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Regional Studies, and obviously for us that makes her an incredibly important person and a very great contributor to the field. These editorial roles are a labour of love, and I really emphasise the word labour, so thank you for that, Jennifer. And I'll introduce Henry straight away. Henry is an economic geographer. He works at the National University of Singapore. Henry has been a board member of the RSA as well. He's also done his labour of love for the community. Both of our speakers have been in receipt of major funding for grants, and I really struggle to think of people that are more qualified to kick us off in this discussion this afternoon. So I'm turning to you first, Jennifer.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you to everyone at the Regional Studies Association for setting this up today. I think we had this conversation in Dublin when we were at the Regional Studies Association meeting, which Daniela Carl helpfully organized, and we discovered in that conversation amongst us, Henry, me, and others, that we had a lot that we wanted to talk about in terms of the question of how to manage grants, how to think about grants, and this is also something we're going to have a dialogue about, I think, going forward. I've been thinking about this a little bit about what I wish somebody had told me before I got into this whole game of applying for and managing grants. At my previous institution, I was actually a director of a research center, at an interdisciplinary research center. And so my experience is in part as an individual researcher, as an individual PI, but also as someone who was running a research center, which was running multiple grants at the same time. So I'll speak to that experience in particular. And part of my sort of perspective on this is faculty facing, like what should faculty be thinking about when they're managing grants, rather than sort of what research administrators should be thinking about, or what institutional administrators should be thinking about. And I think it's important first to point out that your interests as a faculty member in terms of managing grants and applying for grants may be different from your institution, not totally in alignment, and knowing where there's moments of misalignment are really important in terms of your own career management. So I think sort of the first thing you want to do is think about how much funded research is actually important for you to achieve your professional career goals as an academic who does research. And then think about how much time you're willing to spend doing research administration, managing grants, how much time you're willing to do that, as opposed to doing research per se, because managing grants is not the same thing as research. Sometimes it can be, but it very rarely is. And it takes a lot of experience to get more of that overlap to happen. So if there's actually an exchange between research administration and actual research, and you're one of those people who has a real knack for getting research, you have to understand that people are going to want you to manage more grants as time goes on. As people figure out you're good at it, they're going to want you to do more of it. So you may not, really know the answer early on in your career to the question of how much grant money it requires for you to do the kind of research you want to do. And so, you just keep moving, keep applying for grants and keep getting them, but keep the question in your head of sort of the magnitude question of, am I going through and just applying for grants and it's not actually moving me towards this goal? What I'm doing is managing rather than research. Keep that in your head and ask yourself that question at various times during the course of your career. And all of this really varies by institution, and this is and even by sort of national context. And I think this is one of the conversations that Henry and I can have, going forward in this conversation. Is it, in some institutions, you need grant money in order to have PhD advisees, and in others you don't, right? And so sometimes what's really driving a lot of the grant activity has to do with building sort of that research program that you have with doctoral students. In some places, you really can't have doctoral advisees unless you're funding them with grant research, and that sort of defines the story for you. You kind of need to do that. Other places, PhD students are funded through scholarships or fellowships. They're funded through instructional revenue. So it really depends on the question of how those doctoral students are funded in each institutional context, whether the grant funding is necessary to do that. The other thing I think that people really need to think about, again, and this varies by institutional and national context, is the question of whether or not grants are part of the review process in terms of your professional review, your annual review process. So for example, in the US, the criteria for tenure and promotion are different from those for annual review in almost every Research One university. So while grants count a lot for your annual review process, so the review that's done by your administrators, that's done annually, kind of determines your raises, it's not the same thing as what is considered for tenure and promotion. For tenure and promotion, what's much more important is the question of impact and the question of sort of productivity, impact, and fit, whereas the question for annual reviews is really going to be more on that productivity, and grants count much more towards that productivity criteria in that category. So just think about that as you're doing this. So if the point, of getting grants is to support research and build reputation, the issue is that in many ways, from your department's perspective, the simple award, the awarding of the grant alone achieves both, builds reputation, supports research, right? But it's an input, it's not the output. Grants are not the output. And so distinguishing between those two things is pretty important. So one of the first things you kind of have to recognize is that, your institution is going to be more interested in you getting the money And then they are going to be about the sort of specificity of the question of what is the output from that beyond a risk and compliance sort of standpoint. So what you're going to get a lot of support for institutionally is going to be around questions of risk and compliance, that kind of management side of it. You're going to get less support for the purposes of producing high quality, sort of what you would think of as probably high quality research. And that's really where sort of the tension for a faculty PI comes in, right? Is negotiating that institutional context and that administrative support. So one of the things I would suggest to everybody is thinking about what kind of administrative support you can get for managing your grants. And so it's kind of a level of institutional subsidy that you're talking about. So sometimes what that can be is administrative support. So that's really everything from, you know, who's going to help me do the media and communications, who's going to help me, you know, just do the reporting, who's going to do all that kind of stuff. And then there's some issues around the question of, you know, what kind of different flavors of money. I call it different flavors of money because anytime you're doing a grant of any size, there's the actual money that's coming from the external funding source. And then there's sort of the institutional subsidy money, which is a different kind of money. And when I say institutional subsidy, it's generally I'm talking about time, and I'm talking about sort of tuition waivers, that sort of stuff. So money that is within, if you think about this as like a, and I think about this as sort of hard currency versus soft currency. So the institution has like money that's within the institution that's kind of fungible from the institutional side of it. And that's things like tuition waivers, that's things like administrative time. Those things you can ask for and are likely to get. Straight cash, so hard currency, you're much less likely to get. So it becomes smart to start thinking about where the institutional subsidies that you can have to help support your grants is going to come from over time. The minute you get a grant, get out your calendar and work backwards from the end date of the grant. And then set yourself working backwards to the day you're at to think about how you're going to manage your scaling up process so that you can actually meet the requirements and the deliverables that you're talking about, how you're going to build that team. And then also start thinking about how you are going to do sunsetting if this is the only grant, right? And this is one of those key decision points, is the question of whether or not your first grant is going to be, you're going to continue building sort of a grant portfolio, or whether you're going to look at each grant as an independent individual project. And whether or not you scale up a full team, or just look at, you know, a group of PhD students and PIs and maybe a couple of colleagues, has a lot to do with this question of whether you're looking at this as building a grant portfolio or just going one grant funded project to the next. One of the exit strategies you can think about, so what you do when the grant is over is you can think about how you're going to sunset your team, right? Graduate your team. But also the issue of maybe you want to merge your team with another larger institutional center, whether you want to hand it off, you know, hand off that team to another institutional center. All those things are possibilities. And this kind of feeds into the last thing I want to talk about, which is really managing and motivating people on your team. I think, you know, we sort of assume that all faculty, you know how to do all things, and that's not true. Learning how to actually motivate a team to do research means having some self-reflection, that being a great faculty member, being a great researcher doesn't mean you're going to be a great manager of other researchers. So that's a tough one to sort of realize personally, that you're going to have to do some work to be a good leader. And some of that has to do with, you know, understanding what your own gaps may be. And some of those gaps are going to be skill-based gaps, like maybe you're really bad at PowerPoint, and so you need somebody on your team who's going to be good at doing the PowerPoints or good at the social media. And sometimes they're more temperament and personality based, like you might be super impatient. And so when deadlines are missed, you get cranky and you yell at people. And that's not going to be super helpful if you're trying to manage a team over time. So if you're one of those people, you know, think about how you're going to find somebody else on your team who can manage those moments with the rest of the team, and you can step back, right? And that's okay. You don't have to be good at everything. So the other thing I'm going to say is build redundancy into your team, because if there's anything we've learned over the last couple of years, it's that we need to give people a break sometimes. So I think it's more important that we think about this issue of allowing people to take breaks within the term of the grant. Many times we're talking about months and months on these grant projects, and sometimes people need a break, and somebody else needs to pick that up for a little while. So letting people step in and out and learning how you can be a thermostat for your team rather than a thermometer. You don't need to be telling them what the temperature is. You need to be setting the temperature. And that's the way that you're going to really sort of bring your group together so that they understand what the expectations are, so you can meet those deliverable goals over time, and then think about whether the team wants to be together for the next set of grant opportunities that come down the road. So I'll stop there and turn the microphone, so to speak, over to Henry, and look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jennifer. I just made a note of the thermostat versus thermometer, especially as my central heating is not working because my heat pump has stopped working. So all the bits work, except there's no electricity to the bit that says how hot to make the room. Thank you very much for that. That's raised quite a large number of questions for me. But I think what we'll do is make this a debate and move smoothly to Henry, and then open it up and have a conversation. So I just remind colleagues in the room, if you have questions or comments, just pop them in the Q&A box. So Henry, over to you. Let's see if you can be a thermostat and set the temperature.
Well, thank you, everybody. Good evening from hot tropical Singapore. Since we are on temperature matter, it's indeed higher in temperature here, as you can tell in my t-shirt. Yeah. So first of all, thanks to the RSA for inviting me to join this wonderful webinar, and also to Jennifer for setting the broad parameters about grant seeking and management of grants with regard to some important matter, promotion and tenure. Later, maybe we'll come back to some of these issues. For my part, I'm going to focus on sharing my experience in managing a large grant funded by my own university. It's an internal strategic grant that I secure as a principal investigator to fund what is called the Global Production Networks Research Center at the National University of Singapore. I was the director together with Neil Cole, who since recently has moved, but we ran the center between 2014 and last year, 2021. So this ran over about 7 years, and it was funded up to the tune of roughly US $4 million actual money. We had 6 to 7 faculty members from Department of Geography, Economics, Political Science, and Sociology. So that roughly will give you some idea of the parameters of the grant, the sources, and the nature of work. Okay, so for today's purpose, I'm going to make 3 points, and we may expand on some of these issues later on in our discussion and Q&A if necessary. First is to say that for a grant of this nature, for a center of this kind of parameter, it's critical to hire the right project manager or center manager. I think Jennifer alluded to some of these issues just now already. In our context, looking back, we were very, very fortunate to be able to hire a senior manager who runs the center, who's highly effective, and very, very, very important is self-initiating. That again speaks to Jennifer's point that as an active researcher who got the funding, we don't want to be sucked into too much of the administration of the center. So having a very capable, effective manager is a must. But of course, that of course relates to the issue of how do you find such a person? How do you sort of secure his or her interest? In our case, Dion has been very, very sort of loyal to the center. We actually sort of hire her from another university in Singapore, so we were very lucky. We had a very good divisions of labor as well, partly because Neil Cole and myself, we were very sort of speedy in our decision-making process and share understanding of the objective of the center. So when our center manager came back to us on all kinds of administrative, grant matter, claim matter, we could make fairly speedy decisions. So that helped. Of course, in support of the manager, we were lucky also to be able to fund research assist, or we call research assistants, but effectively they are assistants to the manager. So it's not even just one person, but we had two research assistants attached with the centers, if you like, administration. So that again helped on the one hand to deal with some really nitty-gritty, because we have to itemize every single expenditure, things like that. In the early days, we even have to paste the receipts on the paper in order to submit for claim, that kind of stuff. I mean, you can imagine it can be very tedious, but that's only one side of the story, right? Having the right manager will also help us to deal with, for example, major events, which I will talk about briefly in my second point, which is to do with spending, expenditure. So here, of course, for my part, I'm talking about managing funded research project. Means I assume you've already gotten your grant. And the question is how to manage it, how to spend it effectively, and hopefully generate great impact out of the grant, right? So my second point is to be bold and strategic in spending. Now, of course, very often we apply for grants at the time of application, depending on the specific institutional and or national context. Your applications may be very detailed, may not be so detailed. But ultimately, sometimes at the time of applications, we might be relatively less bold, more conservative in our application. But I think after you've gotten the grant, depending again on the context, in our case, we were lucky because our grant application was actually very minimalist. It was an internal strategic grant call. We had a back of envelope grant calculation. Really, I mean, it's not like a well-specified 20-page single-space application, that kind of stuff. So we end up having very few constraints in the sense of, oh yeah, we apply for this and hence we have to deliver and spend this way, right? So we actually end up being able to we got the money first, then decide what to do with it, so to speak. It's kind of partly trust by the university that we'll probably do the right thing. But looking back, we were quite fortunate to be able to be, if you like, endowed with this substantial quantum of funding, half spent on hiring new people, half means about $2 million US that we can actually spend on data collection. So as you can tell, is quite substantial. In terms of our bold thinking, now looking back, this 7 years, in the past 7 years, we're very fortunate with that funding endowment. We venture into expensive data sets. So we were able to acquire some expensive data sets, which took actually time to negotiate as well with data companies. In this case is with what's called the IHS and Market, which provide industry level data. As you know, we work on global production networks of specific industries. We want to have really very fine-grained data across many of these industries. We never knew those costs in advance. Actually, we never even knew the existence of some of these data companies before we got a grant. Now they have actually produced a book on electronics industry based on partly some of the data sets. I realized how important those data sets are because there are all kinds of consultancy and industry level need for those, if you like, future trend predictions, right? But to predict those trends, some of these data companies have very, very good data sets that we can actually acquire and make use of based on, if you like, past trends, time series data, if you like. So I would say the acquisition of some of those data sets in electronics, automotive, I think we did also finance or financial industry would be was very useful for several of the faculty members in our team. So that would be one of my example of our sort of unexpectedly bold spending to the tune of hundreds of thousands of US dollars. Second was that we also spent substantially in organizing what was called the Conference on Global Production in December 2017. I mean, the conference eventually went well, and we were very happy that again, first of all, having a very effective center manager and the team of research assistants help us to organize the conference, about 300 participation, something like that. And it went well. And from our point of view, that was really a worthy exercise from the sort of grant management point of view. It wasn't promised in the original grant application, but it turned out that we realized that, hey, we've got this, we might as well do something to bring the community together. And that was realized in December 2017. The final point I want to make, which is more to do with, if you like, the term I use is about teamwork and transparency. TNT, teamwork and transparency. Okay, what it means is that, when it comes to grant management, we also need to think of, if you like, the entire team of researchers. Now, of course, as PI and director, co-directors, we had the bird's eye view of funding situation, the surpluses or deficits and so on. But then many team members may not have that view, right? And if they are kept in the dark, it's not so good. I think productive, in terms of productive exchange among us in our initiatives, different projects moving forward. I understand that, for example, for some EU-funded projects, you have different packages. I used to sit on certain advisory committees, so certain packages and again, researchers in different packages may not know well in terms of the overall funding expenditure and so on and so forth. What we did was that we tried to keep all our teammates and our partners well informed on grant expenditure and allocation. We in the initial years, the first 2 years, we actually had weekly or bi-weekly meetings of all of the faculty members and research assistants. Of course, center manager joining us with her wonderful Excel sheets, so we could at any time, we'll always devote a bit of time during our meetings to talk about, if you like, not just research progress, but also expenditure progress. Yeah? So in that sense, through that kind of discussion about sort of either actual expenditure or incoming expenditure, different team members may also sort of generate new ideas. It could be ideas to economize on expenditure, but it also can be ideas about how better, if you like, spend on certain kind of activities from hiring human resources for research assistance purpose, to field trips, to overseas trips, to, of course, data acquisition, and so on and so forth. And to me, I think that sharing of spending progress really helped some of the team members to what I would call think big, right? Because again, not until you have a sense that, oh, actually we could do it this way, and oh, actually from your experience, you could actually get hold of that kind of material at that kind of cost. Yeah, let me think about it. In terms of in my area of research, this is also possible too, or they will have new ideas to bring in. So I would strongly suggest that that sense of transparency and teamwork is critical in the kind of a project funding and expenditure. So just to sum up, I made these 3 points about hiring the right center manager, be bold and strategic in your spending thinking, and of course, sharing that idea well through teamwork and transparency, which are all critical, I think, in what's called effective grant management. That's all from me at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you very much to both of you. So I've taken some notes and we've picked out some of the key themes, but I've picked out 2 that I'm going to punt straight back to you that maybe we haven't covered. So we've talked a little bit about personal goals, and I found that very interesting. The idea that as a mid-career researcher, you might choose whether you want 1 grant or 10 grants. It seems like quite a luxurious sort of choice, but I totally get the point behind it, which is that you need to work out what kind of researcher you are. And as somebody that sits like a spider in a web of research community, there are people that run their grants sequentially. This one finishes, the next one starts. And then you have ones that really well manage a platform of grants. So clearly different personality types will approach that in different ways. The second major theme that you both picked up was around team management. So selecting the right people, getting the right people around the table, looking after them, being transparent with them, and so on. You picked up planning, and I love the idea of the Gantt chart, starting from when the final report and the publications are written and then working back. And as somebody that manages, I think RSA now has 8 grants, and they almost all run over. Obviously, during COVID, everything is run over, and that's no problem. But nevertheless, most grants run over. So very good advice, I think. Start with when your final report is due in, and then plot everything back from there. And we've talked about spending. So the 2 things that sort of scream to me as questions are: how would you, as funded research managers, manage inter-institutional collaboration. So what are the problems that come when you're allocating money to people in another institution that has a different culture? It could be in a different country. So that is my first thing. What are the things to think about there? And then my second thing is, it's great if everything goes well, but with some kinds of research, it doesn't. So what's your advice on legal and ethical issues that can occur during grants? So I might punt first to Henry on the inter-institutional collaborations, and then go from there.
Right. Thank you, Sally. Both are very, very challenging questions. Actually, I don't have that great experience to share on both, but let me start with the institutional. Not so much for this grant that I just shared with you, but I was in the past involved in an ESRC project that Jeff Henderson and Peter Dicken had in the UK, that, if you like, kickstart what is called the Global Production Networks Research. I was also involved in another National Science Foundation grant that our current chair of the RSA, Jesse Poon, was the PI. So in both projects, it will be inter-institutional in the sense that I was the NUS, if you like, what's called overseas investigator, involving in both of the projects, not at the same time, but these were in the 2000s, if I recall correctly. My sense would be that I was fortunate to be involved in both grants that were helmed by people I literally love so much. So in that sense, I had the fortune of that initial trust that was already built into our working relationships. That makes it relatively less conflict oriented, so to speak, partly because I had a good sense of what each of the PIs were interested in doing and my sort of potential contribution, and vice versa, of course. They had a good sense of what I was able to do, contribute in relation to the project. So I don't have actual, if you like, negativity to report in such a way that can be sort of, can share the experience of managing. I can only share that I was the fortunate one involving in institutional grants that didn't go too wrong, so to speak.
Lovely.
But maybe Jennifer will have more to share. Yeah.
Jennifer.
Sure. So the two things you're mentioning, the question of legal and ethical concerns and the question of institutional collaborations are linked. So I'm going to go backwards and say that the legal and ethical concerns that are sort of the hot ones are going to be anything about human resources and human resource management, by which I mean the whole panoply of possibilities that fall under that category, and financial management, right? And so those are the two things that can get a PI removed, can get you into serious trouble, can ultimately, depending on your institutional culture, could get you fired even if you have tenure. So, for example, the National Science Foundation in the US at this point has added criteria in the last few years on the question of what Title IX criteria, which means in the US, essentially sexual harassment issues. So if you're the PI and you have a National Science Foundation grant and you were found to have committed sexual harassment that violates NSF standards, you cannot serve as a PI any longer. You will be removed by NSF and your institution, and another PI will be appointed to that grant. So those things are non-trivial. And the other thing is that those things do vary from national context, like what is sort of, or institutional context of what sort of permittable at the margins, right? So some things that in one institutional culture might be considered sort of over the line in terms of how you interact with your employees, less on the question of sexual harassment, but more how do you speak to people, how do you manage their time. Some things in some national contexts are going to be considered to be appropriate for sort of a hot-headed PI, and in others will be entirely over the line and considered to be a violation of sort of the employment relationship within the institution. So those things are serious when you're talking about interinstitutional collaborations. So whether if you're within the same national context and it's an external funding source like a governmental funding source, there's going to be some guidelines about the interinstitutional collaborations and how they're run. So, for example, interinstitutional interdisciplinary programs now that are from the National Science Foundation in the U.S. There's an ungodly amount of paperwork on the front end before you ever get the grant that is about essentially outlining how those relationships between those institutions are going to work. So this kind of gets to the issue of what kind of grant is it? What does the funding source look like? So you basically have your question of governmental and then variation there, industry, philanthropic, and then internal, right? And then those rules are just going to look really different compared, especially the front end stipulations, right? Before you ever get the grant, what they're going to say to you in the grant application process about having smoothed out what those relationships are going to look like, or whether you have to build those on the back end once you get the grant. So for example, the governmental sources are going to be much more concerned about seeing that you have that capability before they ever give you the grant, whereas internal sources or industry or philanthropic are going to be a little more lax about that and want to see that later. Sort of if you mess it up, they're going to want you to fix it, as opposed to wanting to know you know how to do it before they ever even talk to you about the money.
I think that's exactly right, Jennifer. And I think what Henry said, that his institution gave him $4 million US, but not quite on the back of an envelope, but without a very finely specified grant, because they know that Henry and Neil Co have got those soft networks into other research centres. But certainly in a European context where people are applying for European Horizon funding, you have to apply with your partners. It has to be across Europe. It has to hit so many people in the south part or the north and so on. You have to hit those diversities. So I think it's much more difficult, much more likely that there will be interinstitutional challenges in these somewhat artificially built bids that are then funded, where perhaps people don't have those interpersonal connections. And I really liked your comments, Jennifer, around legal. I do think that it's really important that researchers stay in touch with the administrators within the university, because if something goes wrong, my gosh, those are the people that are going to help you resolve the problem. So really important to do all the form filling that you're meant to do for those individuals. We've only got 10 minutes or so left, and I still have some other things that I would like to cover. I was interested in the idea of sunsetting your team. A lot of what you both said about recruiting a team gave me this slightly uncomfortable feeling about the way in which late PhD students and early careers are treated in the academic sector. You know, the gig economy is alive and kicking in most academic institutions. And at the beginning of their career, when they're building relationships, having families, trying to get on housing ladders and so on, people are on multiple short-term contracts. So I think that exit strategy and sunsetting a research team is really interesting. I'd like you both to talk a little bit more about that, and perhaps give any advice you can to individuals who are in that position of moving from short-term contract to short-term contract. Jennifer.
Yeah, no, this was one of the issues that one of the things that I'm glad that I'm now the head of a department, an academic department rather than a research center, really was that I lost a lot of sleep over this issue, the issue of my responsibility as the director of the center for finding ways to keep people on the team until it was time, until they could leave, so that we weren't treating them like they were temps. like that they were academic temps. And the same thing is true for PhD students as it is for postdocs, as it is for sort of your research scientists who are kind of in that liminal, space in their careers. The way that, and this is where it starts to get very complicated about your relationship. I call it sort of the back of the Excel spreadsheet. So what the idea, I mean, I'm so jealous of what Henry described. I would have loved to be part of this, to be in Henry's position in this. But usually what ends up happening when you have multiple grants is most of the people on your team, essentially there's like a shadow Excel spreadsheet behind each one of their full-time equivalencies. So the 100% they're spending with you and your team, 25% is on this grant, 25% is of their salaries on this grant, 25% is on this. And all of those are sunsetting at different moments. You know, those grants end at different moments. So you're trying to bring back in money to essentially make their salary work, right? So that's why I say the research administration here can be incredibly consuming, because you as the PI or you as the director of the center are really looking, as big as your team is, every one of those human beings has a little spreadsheet behind their head, which is all the different funding streams that's making them whole, on your team. And you know, every one of those people has a life. You know, they've got kids, they've got a early career strategy they're trying to manage. And so what I found was really important was to stop thinking about it as like I was some sort of superhero who could make them whole in all contexts. I started to look at it as, here's my institutional context. These people are actually the employees of this university through this center. Where else can they be a part of what other teams can they be a part of? If I go away, how can they still have an off ramp that's not, based on my employment contract with this university, but based on what they're producing, as an employee on this broader team. So that meant I had to look and see who are our cognate centers. Who are the centers who are doing similar work where the skill set can actually be, applied to them as well. And so as we were, as funding was sort of scaling down, the idea was, where can they still plug in? And so they can have some autonomy as to thinking about when they want to leave the institution, as opposed to being sort of punted off the grants when the grants end or when the PI leaves.
Yeah, that really does make sense. And that also prompts me to say that people who are in that position, as they need to be tracking the end dates of any grants that they're working on, and maybe be hustling to be part of new projects well in advance. So individuals need their own Gantt chart working from the back forward as well.
Yeah, and Sally, that goes to Henry's point about transparency, is I think that sometimes faculty PIs feel like sharing the information with the PhD students or the postdocs is something like they're not quite ready for. And I feel exactly, I feel like they are. Like, this is the environment. And sometimes it's a super uncomfortable conversation. And sometimes, younger scholars, I don't want to call it maturity, but their anxiety about this sort of liminality can be a lot for the PI to deal with. And so you're kind of inclined to be like, I'm not going to tell them that this is messy because they can't handle messy. But it is part of their training to understand that this is the career that they're going
and into. Also it's treating your staff as colleagues and equal as human beings. Yes. I totally relate to that. We're really getting close to the end, but I would like you to give one or two very quick top tips to somebody that has just got a large research grant. What should they do in the first month? What is the most important thing in the first month after they've got the grant? Henry?
Well, I would say think very carefully about all of the tasks that will come your way in executing this grant now that you've gotten it, and then make sure that you have a good division of labor, that these are the ones that I really want to do it, and these are the ones that I will be sort of more happy to have someone taking on. And once you have that really entire spectrum of tasks mapped out, then you're able to find, hopefully, the right persons who will then help you in executing this grant. That will be my biggest advice.
So proper strategic helicopter view on the grant. And Jennifer, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's just a variation of what Henry just said, which is, I think within the institution, there are kind of two groups of people you want to talk to really quickly. One is the folks who are going to be managing those pieces for you. But also, I think the other center directors, other allies within the institution who have done this before. So you want to reach out to them, take them to coffee, and ask them some questions, because you're doing two things. One, you're sort of learning what they did, but you're also creating a relationship with them. And I would also encourage people to look through their sort of professional network more broadly and find one or two sort of key informant colleagues who are at other institutions and talk to them about how they did this. And that way you start to get a sense of what the variations are. It helps you sort of highlight the independent variables, so to speak, of what's going on in terms of that variation, and how maybe the people within your institution haven't thought about other models, right? So if you learn about what the other models are, you've got a little bit more flexibility about how you might want to tailor what you're doing.
Oh, I think they're both really, really strong pieces of advice, and always asking other people for what they did, just having conversations with peers. Honestly, that is so important, and that is what, as an association, we really try hard to do, is to build the networks so that our members know people that they can talk to, trusted colleagues and friends they can get advice from. So yeah, I think that really is incredibly important. I would put one thing slightly higher than anything that either of you two have said, which is to organise an immediate party for anybody who has helped you with the application, and have a jolly good evening, because gosh, you probably deserve it. So I would say that first and foremost. After that, get down to business.
Sally, let me just say something about that, which is you're so right. I mean, I think that this goes to the motivation and morale question, right? Sometimes we focus so much our events on the idea of what's the conference going to be, what's the convening going to be, and we forget to have the sort of team celebrations. And absolutely.
Great. Well, I look forward to either of you getting your next big grant, and I hope that my invitation is in the post. And on that cheery note, I would like to very, very warmly thank you both. I think you've given some real pearls of wisdom, and I think that there are a lot of webinars that touch on how to apply to grants, how to position yourself for a grant. There are very, very few that I've seen that deal with what do you do when you've landed a grant. And for those often early mid-career researchers that are in that boat, I think you've given them a really rich stream of ideas to think about. And on their behalf, I thank you for that. I would like to thank also my colleagues in the RSA, particularly Nicola Pilling, Lisa Reynolds and Alex Holmes, who sit behind the scenes on all of these webinars, not just the professional development ones, but also the region, city and industry ones. So without this, honestly, the Regional Studies Association wouldn't function without those individuals. We do have more webinars coming up. The next one is on the 23rd of November, also picking up grants and funding, but this time looking at how to write a winning grant application. So it kind of precedes this one. It's pre-party, it's the pre-party part of the research process, where you're just doing the graft and crossing your fingers. Finally, I would like to thank our audience who are in the room now with us, but I would like to thank our much larger audience who will be joining us in the days, weeks and months to come as they access the video via the RSA portal. So to all of you, I say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.